March 1945. Manila Harbor burned behind them as three Japanese women, a nurse, a teacher, and a 19-year-old girl, were pulled from dark water by American sailors. They had been taught one unshakable truth: capture by Americans meant torture, assault, and death. Keiko whispered a prayer, not for rescue, but for it to be quick. Yet the sailors handed them blankets. A medic wrapped Ayumi's burned hand without a word. No violence, no chains, just silence. Then came the transport orders. Texas, a prisoner of war camp in the desert. Fumiko clutched a hidden cyanide capsule and made a pact with the others. They would die with dignity before the Americans broke them. But when they arrived at Camp Crystal City, something impossible waited. They were about to discover that everything they'd been told about the enemy was a lie. Before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, smash that subscribe button. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories reach. The water was black and cold, and it tasted like oil. Keiko Matsuda clung to a piece of wooden debris that had once been part of the ship's railing, her fingers numb, her legs kicking weakly against the pull of the current. Around her, the darkness was punctuated by small fires floating on the surface, fuel from the ruptured tanks, burning in patches that cast orange light across the faces of other survivors. Some called out in panic. Others had gone silent. Keiko had stopped calling for help 20 minutes ago. There was no point. The ship was gone. The evacuation fleet had scattered. And somewhere in the smoke-thick sky above Manila Bay, American planes circled like predators waiting for dawn. She had been a hospital nurse for 3 years, stationed at the Imperial Army Field Hospital near the port. She had seen enough death to recognize its approach. The water was too cold. Her strength was fading. And even if she made it to shore, the Americans were already there, sweeping through the city block by block. She had heard the stories from wounded soldiers, what the enemy did to captured women. The officers had been clear. Death was preferable. Death was honorable. Capture was a stain that could never be washed away. So when the searchlight swept across the water and caught her in its beam, Keiko closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Not for rescue, for a quick end, for her mother never to know how she died. The American patrol boat cut its engine and drifted closer. She heard boots on the deck, the metallic clank of equipment, voices speaking a language she had studied in school but never truly learned. Hands reached down. She was too weak to resist. They hauled her up like a sack of rice, water streaming from her uniform, her hair plastered to her face. She waited for the blow, for the rough hands, for the beginning of what she had been promised would happen. Instead, someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Keiko opened her eyes. A young sailor, maybe 20 years old, was crouching in front of her, his face shadowed beneath his helmet. He said something in English she did not understand, then gestured to a spot near the cabin where other women sat huddled together. He did not touch her again. He just pointed, then moved away to help pull another survivor aboard. She stumbled to the group and sank down beside them, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Across from her sat Fumiko Hayashi, a schoolteacher from Tokyo who had been on the same evacuation ship, her right wrist bent at an unnatural angle, her face pale with pain. Next to Fumiko was Ayumi Kobayashi, barely 19, her left hand wrapped in a piece of torn cloth that was soaked through with blood. The girl stared at nothing, her lips moving in silent repetition of something Keiko could not hear. No one spoke. They waited for what came next. What came next was a medic. He knelt beside Ayumi without asking permission and gently unwrapped the cloth from her burned hand. She flinched, but did not pull away. He cleaned the wound with something that made her gasp. then wrapped it in clean white gauze from a kit that looked too well stocked to be real. When he finished, he moved to Fumiko and examined her wrist with careful fingers, his expression neutral, professional. He said something to another sailor who brought a splint and tape. Within minutes, Fumiko's wrist was immobilized, and the medic had moved on to check Keiko's pupils with a small flashlight, looking for signs of concussion. Keiko sat frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile what was happening with what she had been taught to expect. This was not torture. This was not assault. This was medical care. Competent, impersonal, efficient medical care. The kind she herself had provided to wounded soldiers 100 times. The kind that made no sense in this context, in this moment, with these people who were supposed to be monsters. The patrol boat delivered them to a staging area on Guam 3 hours later. More barbed wire, more uniforms, a field hospital tent where a doctor, an actual doctor, not a brutish interrogator, set Fumiko's wrist properly and gave her something for the pain. They were photographed, fingerprinted, given thin cotton dresses to replace their soaked uniforms, assigned to a barracks with cots and blankets. For 3 days, they existed in a strange limbo of silence and processed paperwork. Guards stood at the perimeter, but no one entered the barracks. No one asked questions. Red Cross parcels appeared twice a day: crackers, canned fruit, powdered milk. It was more food than Keiko had seen in the last 6 months of rationing in Manila. On the 4th day, an officer arrived with a clipboard and a translator. He read names from a list. Keiko heard her own name, then Fumiko's, then Ayumi's. The translator, a Japanese-American woman with a tired face, explained in flat, precise Japanese that they were being transferred. Not released, not interrogated, transferred. To the United States mainland, to a place called Texas, to a prisoner of war camp. The barracks erupted in whispers. Fumiko's face went white. Someone behind Keiko began to weep. Ayumi closed her eyes and seemed to fold inward, her breathing shallow and fast. That night, lying on her cot in the darkness, Keiko stared at the canvas ceiling and tried to understand. The kindness had been a lie, a trick, a way to soften them before the real punishment began. Of course, it made sense now. They had been treated well only to make the contrast sharper when they arrived at the labor camps. She had heard about American labor camps from the propaganda broadcasts. Prisoners worked to death in desert heat, starved, beaten, forgotten. Texas was a desert. Texas was where they sent people to disappear. Fumiko found her the next morning before dawn. The older woman's face was composed, but her hands shook as she showed Keiko what she had hidden in the lining of her dress. A small capsule, white and smooth, no bigger than a pill. Cyanide. An officer in Manila had pressed it into her palm during the evacuation, his voice urgent. "Use it before they break you," he had said. "Die as a Japanese woman, not as their plaything." Fumiko looked at Keiko with something like defiance. "We make a pact," she said quietly. "The 3 of us. We do not beg. We do not forget who we are. And if it becomes unbearable, we choose our own end. Together. With dignity." Keiko found Ayumi in the corner of the barracks, staring at her bandaged hand. When they told her about the pact, the girl nodded once, her expression empty. She had already decided she would not survive this. Keiko could see it in her eyes. The plane to Texas left at noon. As it climbed into the sky and the island fell away beneath them, Keiko pressed her forehead against the small window and watched the endless blue give way to clouds. Somewhere below was the ocean. Somewhere beyond that was home. And somewhere ahead, in a place she could not imagine, was a camp with barbed wire and guard towers and a future she was certain would be worse than drowning. The heat hit them the moment the transport truck's canvas flap was pulled back. It was a different kind of heat than Manila, dry instead of humid, vast instead of contained. Keiko stepped down onto Texas soil and felt the sun press against her skin like a physical weight. The sky was enormous, pale blue and cloudless, stretching in every direction over flat brown earth, dotted with scrub brush and distant trees that looked nothing like the palms she knew. The air smelled like dust and something green she could not name. Camp Crystal City sat in the middle of that emptiness like a small, contained world. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines behind double fences of barbed wire. Guard towers rose at intervals, their silhouettes sharp against the bright sky. An American flag snapped in the hot wind at the center of the compound. Keiko counted the buildings as they were marched through the main gate. Too many to be just punishment cells. Too organized to be chaos. It looked like a small town, carefully planned, unnervingly orderly. They were processed in a building near the entrance, photographed again, this time holding numbered cards, fingerprinted again, though Keiko could not understand why they needed her prints twice. A woman in a crisp military uniform measured her height, checked her teeth like she was livestock, wrote notes on a form attached to a clipboard. Then came the clothing. Not rags, not prison stripes. Actual dresses with buttons and hems, in sizes that almost fit. Keiko was handed 2 dresses, underwear that was new, 2 pairs of socks, and shoes that were worn but intact. She held them in her arms and stared at the pile, confused. Fumiko stood beside her, clutching her own bundle of clothes. The teacher's face was tight with suspicion. When the uniformed woman pointed them toward a changing area, Fumiko leaned close to Keiko and whispered in Japanese, "They are making us presentable for something. This is preparation. Do not trust it." But when Keiko pulled on the dress in the privacy of the changing room and felt the cotton against her skin, clean, soft, smelling faintly of soap, she could not make herself believe it was all theater. Someone had washed these clothes. Someone had sorted them by size. Someone had cared enough to provide underwear and socks, items no one would see, items that served no propaganda purpose. Her hands shook as she buttoned the front. They were assigned to Barracks 12, a long wooden building with a sloped roof and screened windows. Inside, rows of metal frame beds lined both walls, each with a thin mattress, a folded blanket, and a pillow. Keiko touched the mattress. It gave slightly under her fingers. Not straw, not bare boards. An actual mattress. She sat down carefully, half expecting it to collapse or reveal some hidden cruelty. It held her weight. It was almost comfortable. Ayumi took the bed beside hers without speaking. The girl moved like a ghost, mechanically arranging her belongings, which consisted of nothing, on the small shelf beside the bed. Fumiko chose a bed near the door, her jaw set, her eyes scanning the room as if cataloging escape routes. That afternoon, they were summoned to an assembly in the central yard. Dozens of women gathered in the shade of a large building, most of them Japanese, some German, a few Italian. Keiko recognized the tension in their postures, the careful distance they maintained from the guards, who stood at the perimeter. A man in an officer's uniform stepped onto a small platform at the front. He was older, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of exhaustion rather than cruelty. He held a piece of paper and cleared his throat. Then he began to speak in Japanese. The accent was terrible, the grammar awkward, but the words were clear enough. He introduced himself as Captain Frank Hollis, commander of Camp Crystal City. He explained that they were being held under the guidelines of the Geneva Convention, that they would be assigned work duties, that they would be paid for their labor, that they would be allowed to send and receive letters through the International Red Cross, that they would receive medical care, recreational time, and access to religious services, that as long as they followed the rules, they would be treated with respect. Keiko listened to the words and heard only propaganda. Fumiko's expression confirmed it. The teacher's mouth was a thin line of contempt. Around them, other women shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads slightly. It was too absurd to believe. Paid for labor, letters home, respect. These were the lies they would tell before the real treatment began. The lies designed to make them compliant, to strip away their last defenses before the cruelty started. But that night, lying on the mattress in Barracks 12, Keiko could not sleep. The blanket was thin but clean. The pillow smelled like sun-dried cotton. Through the screened window, she could hear cicadas singing in the darkness, a sound so ordinary, so peaceful, that it felt obscene. She heard Fumiko breathing in the next row, steady but not asleep. She heard Ayumi shift restlessly, whimpering once in her sleep before falling silent again. Keiko stared at the wooden ceiling and tried to feel the anger she was supposed to feel, the righteous hatred, the defiant rage. But all she felt was confusion. And beneath the confusion, something more dangerous, a tiny, traitorous whisper of relief. She was not chained. She was not beaten. She was not locked in a cell. She was lying on a mattress in a building with windows, listening to insects sing, wrapped in a blanket that someone had washed and folded. It felt wrong. It felt like a trap. It felt like something she could not afford to trust. The next morning they received their work assignments. Keiko was sent to the camp infirmary, Fumiko to the education building, where Japanese children of other internees attended school, Ayumi to the kitchen and laundry facility. They were each given a card with their assignment printed in both English and Japanese, along with a schedule and a map of the camp. Keiko studied the map as she walked to the infirmary, noting the layout, the distances, the location of the fences. The infirmary was a long, low building that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax. Inside, a woman in a white nurse's uniform looked up from a desk covered in charts. She was black, her hair pinned back neatly, her expression neutral and assessing. She studied Keiko for a long moment, then gestured to a row of cabinets along the wall. She said something in English that Keiko did not understand, then mimed the action of organizing supplies. Keiko nodded and moved to the cabinets. For 3 hours, she sorted bandages, counted bottles of iodine, arranged instruments in metal trays. The work was familiar, mindless, safe. The black nurse worked at the desk, occasionally glancing over to check Keiko's progress, but never speaking, never approaching. When noon came, the nurse gestured to a small table near the window and produced 2 wrapped sandwiches from a basket. She placed one in front of Keiko and kept one for herself. Then she ate in silence, looking out the window at the dusty yard beyond. Keiko unwrapped the sandwich slowly. White bread, some kind of meat, a thin slice of cheese. She took a small bite and chewed carefully, waiting for the sickness, the poison, the punishment. It tasted like food. Simple, plain food. She took another bite. The nurse did not watch her, did not comment, just finished her own sandwich, wiped her hands on a cloth, and returned to her charts. When Keiko returned to the barracks that evening, she found Fumiko sitting on her bed, staring at a piece of paper in her hands. The teacher looked up, her face pale. She held out the paper wordlessly. It was a list of supplies, textbooks, chalk, paper, pencils, writing brushes, ink, everything needed to run a proper classroom, everything Fumiko had not seen since leaving Tokyo. Fumiko's hands trembled. "Why would they give us this?" she whispered. "What is the purpose? What do they want from us?" Keiko had no answer. She sat on her own bed and pulled off her shoes, feeling the ache in her feet from standing all day. Ayumi appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen, her dress damp with sweat. She held out her hand without speaking. In her palm lay 4 coins, 80 cents, her first day's wages. The 3 women stared at the money as if it were a riddle they could not solve. The weeks passed in a rhythm that Keiko found more unsettling than any cruelty could have been. She woke at dawn to the sound of a bell, washed her face in cold water from a shared basin, dressed in one of her 2 cotton dresses, and walked across the dusty yard to the infirmary. Nurse Dorothy Hayes, she had learned the woman's name from a chart on the desk, arrived precisely at 7 each morning, nodded once in greeting, and began the day's work without unnecessary conversation. They organized supplies together. They changed bandages on prisoners who came in with cuts or infections. They administered aspirin for headaches and wrapped sprained ankles, and monitored a German man with pneumonia who recovered slowly in one of the back beds. What disturbed Keiko most was the sameness of the care. Dorothy treated the German man with the same attention she gave to a Japanese woman with stomach pains. She used the same clean instruments, the same careful technique, the same calm voice explaining procedures in English that neither patient fully understood. When an American guard came in with a deep gash on his forearm from a barbed wire fence, Dorothy cleaned and stitched the wound with the same steady hands she used on everyone else, then sent him away with the same instructions about keeping it dry. Keiko watched and tried to find the deception. This had to be performance, theater designed for some purpose she could not yet identify. But Dorothy never glanced toward the door to see if anyone was observing. She never altered her behavior when Captain Hollis stopped by to check on supply levels. She simply worked efficiently and without drama, as if the nationality of the person bleeding in front of her was no more relevant than the weather outside. One afternoon in late April, Dorothy handed Keiko a stack of patient cards and gestured toward the filing cabinet. As Keiko sorted them alphabetically, she noticed her own card in the stack. She hesitated, then opened it. Her name in careful handwriting, her age, her medical history as reported during intake, and at the bottom, in Dorothy's precise script, a note. Steady hands, good instincts. Observes before acting. Natural nurse. Keiko closed the card quickly and filed it, her chest tight with something she could not name. It was an evaluation, a professional assessment, the kind a teacher would write about a promising student. Not the kind of note anyone would make about livestock or an enemy to be broken. Fumiko's transformation was slower and more resistant. She arrived at the education building each morning with her jaw set, prepared to endure whatever humiliation awaited. Instead, she found Lieutenant James Crawford, a young officer with earnest eyes and terrible Japanese pronunciation, who asked her opinion on lesson plans and handed her actual textbooks, worn but intact copies of mathematics primers, geography texts, and Japanese language readers that must have been collected from internee families. He explained, in his clumsy Japanese, that the children in the camp needed structure and learning to maintain hope. He treated Fumiko not as a prisoner to be managed, but as a colleague whose expertise he lacked. She hated him for it. She hated how he asked questions instead of giving orders. She hated how he brought her tea in the afternoon and asked if the classroom needed better lighting. She hated how he admitted, with obvious embarrassment, that he had never actually taught children before and would value her guidance. Most of all, she hated how his respect made it impossible to maintain the clean hatred she needed to survive. But the children were another matter. 23 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, children of Japanese families who had been interned since 1942. They arrived each morning hungry for routine, for the familiar rhythms of education, for someone who would teach them the language and customs of a country most of them barely remembered. Fumiko stood before them that first day, intending to maintain cold distance, and found herself instead demonstrating calligraphy strokes with a brush Crawford had somehow procured. She found herself explaining the meaning of kanji characters. She found herself correcting posture and praising effort and organizing their chaotic energy into the structured beauty of learning. By the third week, she had requested more supplies. By the fourth, She was staying late to prepare lessons. And by the 6th week, when Crawford asked if she would be willing to teach an evening class for adults who wanted to improve their English, she said yes before she could stop herself. Ayumi's world was smaller and quieter, but no less confusing. She worked in the kitchen under the supervision of Corporal Eddie Martinez, a young man with dark hair and an easy smile who spoke Spanish to the other kitchen workers and broken English to everyone else. He never touched her without warning. He never raised his voice. When she dropped a stack of plates on her second day and they shattered across the floor, she had frozen in terror, waiting for the blow. Instead, Eddie had shrugged, handed her a broom, and said something in English that sounded almost apologetic, as if the plates breaking were somehow his fault for stacking them too high. He taught her words. Potato. Onion. Careful. Hot. He showed her how to make tortillas from scratch, his grandmother's recipe, and let her try pressing the dough even though her first attempts were lumpy and uneven. He snuck her extra food, a roll, an apple, a piece of cheese, sliding it across the counter when no one was looking, then turning away as if he had not noticed her taking it. The money kept appearing. 80 cents each day, paid out on Friday afternoons in a small envelope with her name printed on the outside. Ayumi saved every coin in a cloth bag she kept under her mattress. She did not know what the money meant or what she was supposed to do with it. She only knew that in the comfort station in Manila, she had never been paid. She had been property, a tool, less valuable than the furniture. Here, someone counted her hours and calculated her wages and handed her money as if her labor had worth. It was Fumiko who received the first letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May, delivered by a Red Cross worker who checked names against a list and handed out thin envelopes to a dozen prisoners gathered in the yard. Fumiko stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Her name in Japanese characters, a return address in Tokyo, her sister's handwriting. She carried it back to the barracks and sat on her bed for an hour before opening it. The letter was short. Her sister was alive. Their mother was alive. The house had survived the bombings. They were hungry and frightened, but they were alive. And they had received Fumiko's first letter from the camp, the one she had written in March, barely believing it would actually be delivered. They knew where she was. They knew she was safe. Her sister wrote, "We thought you were dead. We held a funeral. Mother cried for weeks, and now you are alive. How can this be possible? How are the Americans treating you? Are you hurt? Please write again. Please tell us everything." Fumiko read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. She sat there until Keiko came back from the infirmary and found her crying silently in the dimming light. That evening, Keiko wrote her own letter. She sat at the small table in the barracks common area, with a piece of paper Crawford had given Fumiko and a borrowed pencil. She wrote to her mother in careful characters, explaining where she was, that she was unharmed, that she was working as a nurse. She did not mention the wages or the mattresses or Nurse Dorothy's professional respect. She did not know how to explain those things without sounding like she had been brainwashed. Instead, she wrote about the sky and the heat and the strange birds she saw outside the infirmary window. She wrote that she hoped her brother had survived, and that she thought of home every day. She sealed the letter and handed it to the Red Cross worker the next morning, still half convinced it would never arrive. But 3 weeks later, a response came. Her mother's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. Her brother was alive, injured in Hiroshima but alive. The house was damaged, food was scarce, but they were surviving. And they had hope now, because Keiko was alive and the war would end eventually, and someday they would see each other again. Keiko read the letter in the infirmary during her lunch break. Dorothy glanced over, saw tears on Keiko's face, and quietly pushed a box of tissues across the desk without comment. Then she returned to her charts and let Keiko cry in peace. July brought heat that shimmered off the ground in visible waves and turned the barracks into ovens by mid-afternoon. It also brought Tanabata, the Star Festival, and Fumiko surprised herself by asking Lieutenant Crawford if she could organize a small celebration for the children. He had looked startled, then pleased, and within 2 days had somehow procured colored paper, string, and bamboo poles that the maintenance crew helped install in the yard outside the education building. Fumiko taught the children to write wishes on strips of paper and hang them from the bamboo. She told them the story of Orihime and Hikoboshi, the separated lovers who could meet only once a year when a bridge of magpies crossed the Milky Way. The children wrote wishes in careful characters. "I wish to go home. I wish for my father to come back. I wish for the war to end." Simple desires that broke Fumiko's heart even as she helped them fold the paper and tie it to the branches. That evening, families gathered in the yard as the sun set. Someone had lanterns. Someone else had managed to make dango from the kitchen's rice supplies. Corporal Martinez appeared with a guitar and played slow, gentle melodies that were not Japanese, but felt appropriate nonetheless. Keiko stood at the edge of the gathering, watching children run between the bamboo poles, their laughter high and bright in the cooling air. Ayumi sat on the ground nearby, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust, her face tilted toward the first stars appearing overhead. For 3 hours, the camp felt like something other than a prison. It felt like a community marking time together, holding on to threads of culture and memory in a foreign land. American staff lingered at the perimeter, not interfering, just present. Captain Hollis watched from near the administration building, his expression unreadable in the gathering dark. When the children began to tire and families drifted back to their barracks, Fumiko remained standing beneath the bamboo, looking up at the paper wishes fluttering in the night breeze. Crawford approached carefully, maintaining respectful distance. He said something in English, then tried again in his broken Japanese. "Beautiful, the children. Happy today, thank you." Fumiko did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the wishes overhead. "They should not have to wish for home," she said in Japanese, not caring if he understood. "They should be there. This should not be their childhood." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in English that Fumiko understood better than she let on. "You're right. It shouldn't be. None of this should be." She finally turned to look at him. He was not smiling. He looked tired and sad and very young. She realized he was probably only 29 or 30, barely older than Keiko, playing at authority in a system he had not built and could not change. She felt her anger soften slightly, and she hated that too. The news came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early August. Keiko was restocking bandages when she heard shouting from outside. She went to the infirmary door and saw people running toward the administration building, a crowd forming in the yard. Dorothy appeared beside her, frowning. They walked together toward the commotion. Captain Hollis stood on the steps of the administration building, holding a piece of paper, his face gray. He read aloud in English first, then waited while a translator repeated the words in Japanese and German. A bomb. A city called Hiroshima. Destruction beyond measure. Then, 3 days later, another bomb. Nagasaki. And finally, the words that made the crowd go silent. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Keiko felt the ground tilt beneath her. She thought of her brother, injured in Hiroshima. The letter had said he survived the March bombings. But this was August. This was something new. This was a bomb that destroyed cities. She felt Dorothy's hand on her elbow, steadying her, and realized she was swaying. Around her, reactions splintered in every direction. Some prisoners wept. Others stood frozen. A few shouted in anger or disbelief. An older Japanese man near the front of the crowd began singing the national anthem, his voice cracking, and several others joined him in defiant grief. Fumiko pushed through the crowd and walked away rapidly, her shoulders rigid. Ayumi simply sank to the ground where she stood and covered her face with her hands. That night, the barracks was heavy with silence. No one spoke. Keiko lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what surrender meant. Japan had never surrendered. It was unthinkable, impossible. The empire that had promised victory, that had demanded total sacrifice, had given up. Everything they had been told, every promise, every assurance, had been a lie. The soldiers who died believing they were protecting the homeland had died for nothing. The cities bombed to rubble had burned for nothing. And she was here, in Texas, alive and well-fed and paid for her work, while her country collapsed into defeat. The guilt was suffocating. She had survived while Japan fell. She had been treated well, while her people suffered. She had begun to feel almost safe, while her brother lay injured in a city that might not exist anymore. The comfort of the mattress beneath her felt obscene. The memory of Dorothy's steadying hand felt like betrayal. Everything felt wrong. Fumiko appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. She held something in her hand, the cyanide capsule. She looked at Keiko, then at Ayumi, who sat on her bed with her knees drawn up to her chest. "We should have used these at sea," Fumiko said quietly. We lost everything, and we are here alive, while our country burns. What are we now? What is left of us?" Keiko had no answer. Ayumi said nothing, just rocked slightly, her eyes distant. The following days were chaos contained by routine. Work continued because there was nothing else to do. Keiko went to the infirmary. Fumiko went to the classroom. Ayumi went to the kitchen. But everything felt hollow. Prisoners moved like ghosts through the compound. Some refused to eat. Others stayed in their barracks, faces turned to the wall. The camp administration posted notices about repatriation procedures, about the gradual process of returning prisoners to Japan. But the timeline was vague, and the future uncertain. A week after the surrender, Captain Hollis announced a memorial service. It would be held in the camp's small chapel. It would honor all war dead from all nations. Attendance was voluntary. Most of the Japanese prisoners refused to attend the memorial service. Fumiko announced she would not go and spent the morning sitting on her bed, the cyanide capsule beside her on the blanket, staring at it as if it might offer answers. Ayumi said nothing either way, just continued her silent retreat into a place where words could not reach her. But Keiko found herself walking toward the chapel on that hot August afternoon, driven by something she could not explain even to herself. The chapel was small and plain, with wooden benches and windows that let in bars of dusty sunlight. A handful of American staff sat near the front. A few German prisoners occupied the middle rows. Keiko slipped into the back and sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. She told herself she could leave at any moment. She told herself she was only curious about what the Americans would say. The chaplain was an older man with kind eyes and a voice that carried without shouting. He spoke in English about loss and grief and the terrible mathematics of war, how suffering could not be measured or compared, how every death diminished the world, how mothers wept in the every language. He read names, American names, British names. He paused, then read Japanese names too, slowly and carefully, stumbling over the pronunciation but trying. Keiko's throat tightened. He talked about the bombs, about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about the impossible choice to end a war by destroying cities. His voice cracked when he spoke about children who died instantly, about shadows burned into walls, about a weapon that changed what war meant forever. He did not justify it. He did not explain it away. He simply named it as a wound that could not be healed, only carried. Then he spoke about hatred and how it fed on itself, how one atrocity justified the next until no one remembered who started the chain. He spoke about the cost of seeing enemies as less than human, about what happened when nations convinced their people that cruelty was patriotism. And he spoke about the small, radical act of refusing to participate, of treating prisoners as people, of following rules that protected dignity, of choosing restraint when vengeance would have been easier. Keiko left before the service ended. She walked quickly back to the barracks, her vision blurred, her chest tight. She found Fumiko still sitting on her bed, still staring at the capsule. Keiko sat down beside her and said nothing for a long time. Finally, Fumiko spoke, her voice hoarse. I wanted them to be monsters. I needed them to be monsters. Because if they are not monsters, then everything we were taught was a lie. And if everything was a lie, then what did we sacrifice for? What did our soldiers die for? What was any of it for? Keiko had no answer. She just sat beside Fumiko in the hot silence of the barracks, listening to cicadas sing outside the screened windows. 2 days later, Captain Hollis called Keiko, Fumiko, and Ayumi to his office. They walked across the compound together, each woman certain this was finally the reckoning. The wages had been a trick. The letters had been bait. Now came the punishment they had been waiting for all along. Hollis sat behind his desk, looking more tired than threatening. He gestured for them to sit. Then he picked up 3 envelopes and placed them on the desk. Keiko's name was written on one in careful English script. He slid it toward her. Red Cross, he said, then waited while the translator, Mrs. Sato, explained in Japanese. Another letter. Your mother. It arrived yesterday. Keiko took the envelope with shaking hands. She opened it carefully. Her mother's handwriting. Her brother was alive. He had been outside Hiroshima when the bomb fell. He was injured, badly burned, but he was alive. Her mother wrote about the devastation, about the unimaginable destruction, but also about neighbors helping neighbors, about people sharing food, about small acts of kindness in the ruins. She wrote, Your brother says the light was brighter than 1,000 suns. But he survived. You survived. We will rebuild. Somehow we will rebuild. Keiko pressed the letter to her chest and felt something break open inside her. Not relief exactly, not joy, something more complicated. Permission, maybe, to be alive, to be grateful for that, to not apologize for surviving. Hollis looked at the 3 women with an expression that was hard to read. He spoke in English, and Mrs. Sato translated, her voice steady and clear. War's over. You'll go home eventually. Processing takes time. Paperwork, ships. Could be months. Could be longer. But while you're here, in this camp, under my watch, you're people. Not numbers, not trophies, not enemies. People. He paused, his jaw working as if he was deciding whether to continue. Then he said, I know what you were told about us. I know what you expected. Hell, I know what we did to your cities. His voice fractured slightly. I know what happened in those camps in the Philippines, in the Pacific Islands. I've read the reports, I've seen photographs. I know what our boys went through when they were captured by Japanese forces. And I know what some people think should happen here because of that. He picked up a folder and opened it. Inside were papers, official-looking documents. He did not read from them, just looked at them for a moment before continuing. I could have run this camp differently. No one would have questioned it. Revenge is easy. It's natural. It feels like justice. But Geneva Convention rules are real. They're not suggestions. They're the line between civilization and barbarism. And someone, somewhere, has to hold that line. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Fumiko's hands were trembling in her lap. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cyanide capsule. She held it up so Hollis could see it, her arm shaking. I was supposed to use this, she said in Japanese. and Mrs. Sato translated. An officer in Manila gave it to me. He said you would give me a reason to. He said Americans were demons who would destroy me slowly. He said death was better than capture. She set the capsule on the desk between them. It sat there, small and white and deadly. You didn't, she said, and her voice broke. You didn't give me a reason. You treated me like a teacher. You gave me students and books and paper. You paid me. You let me write to my family. You let me celebrate our festivals. And I hate you for it. I hate you because you made it impossible to hate you. Hollis looked at the capsule for a long time. Then he looked at Fumiko. I'm glad you didn't use it, he said quietly. And even through the translation, the sincerity was unmistakable. Keiko felt her own hand moving to her pocket. She had not told anyone, but she had kept something too, not a capsule, but a sharp piece of metal she had found in the infirmary, hidden away for months as insurance. She pulled it out and placed it beside Fumiko's capsule. Then Ayumi, moving slowly as if underwater, reached into the lining of her dress and produced her own capsule, the one she had never mentioned, and added it to the collection. 3 small deaths that were no longer needed. Hollis looked at the pile of hidden weapons, his face unreadable. Then he stood and walked to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a small wooden box and brought it back to the desk. Carefully, using a handkerchief, he picked up each item and placed them in the box. He closed the lid. I'll keep these, he said. Not as evidence, just as a reminder of what didn't happen here.